November 1923, August 1933, September 1939. In 16 years, Germany goes from wheelbarrows of worthless paper to the most terrifying war machine in Europe. How? Not magic, bookkeeping, a shadow bank, and one man the world called a financial wizard, Hjalmar Schacht. Behind the speeches and rallies, a secret factory of paper promises, MEFO bills, hid billions in debt and bought time. When those IOUs came due, there was no cash left, only a choice. Seize private savings, force banks to plug the hole, or turn outward and grab resources by force. This is the story of a financial sleight of hand that helped arm a nation, and why those hidden debts made war almost inevitable.
Germany, 1923. Hyperinflation has shredded public trust, wiped personal savings, and left veterans and pensioners destitute. The currency crisis and the humiliation of Versailles created fertile ground for radical politics, but the nation still had engineers, factories, and an industrial culture that could be revived. By 1924, the Rentenmark stabilized prices, yet the wounds remained: mass unemployment and political fragmentation. Into that breach walked a generation determined to restore national dignity, a project that would soon be paid for not with balanced budgets, but with creative accounting and covert credit.
1929's Wall Street crash sends a shockwave across Europe. German exports collapse. Factories shutter. By January 1933, roughly 6 million Germans are unemployed, a nation teetering on social collapse. Political desperation turned economic policy into political theater. The new Nazi government promised work and order. The problem was simple and brutal. Where would the money come from to build roads, rearm industry, and mobilize millions into employment? Traditional fiscal remedies would take years. The regime needed immediate purchasing power to put men back into factories and trucks on the roads. That need begot an urgent financial invention: a way to pay armament contractors without putting the spending on the official books.
Enter Hjalmar Schacht, banker, currency stabilizer, and one of the architects of the Nazis' economic daring. Schacht had helped stabilize the mark in 1923, and by the early 1930s had the Reichsbank's levers in his hands. He understood liquidity, credit, and the psychology of markets, and he offered a dangerous bargain: concealed rearmament spending off the books long enough for industry to boom and unemployment to vanish. The instrument he devised was simple on paper, but radical in effect: a shadow IOU, issued by a shell company, discountable at the Reichsbank, circulating like money. It created the appearance of prosperity while hiding an expanding mountain of future claims. Schacht sold the miracle and the risk.
Metallurgical Forçage Gesellschaft, MEFO. Armament firms accepted MEFO bills, commercial bills of exchange, from the government in payment for orders. Those bills paid a handsome interest and could be discounted at the Reichsbank, effectively turning MEFO paper into cash for suppliers without putting direct Reich budget entries on public ledgers. To ordinary Germans, the economy looked like booming order books and full factories. In reality, the state had created a parallel credit loop: IOUs that circulated like money, but were legally the obligation of a tiny shell company.
MEFO's genius was also its danger.
The bills had 90-day terms that were repeatedly rolled over and extended, turning short-term IOUs into multi-year obligations. By keeping bills unredeemed and continually refinancing them, the system masked an expanding stock of hidden debt, like a Ponzi that needs ever greater new issuance to pay old holders. The regime relied on confidence. As long as firms and banks believed MEFO paper was secure and the Reich could always roll it over, the wheels turned. But the scale mattered. By the late 1930s, billions in MEFO obligations sat off the official books, and the cushion could vanish if holders demanded cash or international scrutiny closed access to credit.
MEFO was vital, but it wasn't the whole story. The Reich mobilized other fiscal levers: regulated credit, forced saving schemes, payroll-based involuntary loans, and the redirection of corporate profits into state priorities. The 4-year plan under Göring reoriented industry toward strategic materials. Preferential government contracts, trade credits, and barter deals, notably with countries like the USSR pre-1941 for raw materials, provided in-kind supplies. The regime also used customs policy, export promotion, and covert foreign credit lines to sustain imports of key inputs while claiming fiscal restraint at home. These streams buffered the visible budget, but increased the economy's vulnerability to resource shocks and political isolation. To outside observers, Germany appeared to fund much of its recovery through rising exports and clever diplomacy. In truth, foreign credit, both concealed and formal, played a part, as did purchases of strategic imports financed by trade credits and barter. Meanwhile, propaganda sold autarky even as the economy remained dependent on imported ores, fuels, and machine parts. The political calculus was stark. The more the regime hid and deferred costs, the more it needed access to external supplies or territorial expansion to secure resources. Historians argue that this mismatch, a wartime economy financed by peacetime illusion, helped push political decision-makers toward seizure rather than long-term fiscal repair. By 1938, the regime had normalized massive off-book liabilities, roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO obligations alongside official debt, and the fiscal room for maneuver was shrinking. Schacht had warned that the system could not be sustained forever. Others in the leadership, bound to rapid rearmament and Hitler's timelines, accepted the gamble. When redemption pressures rose and international tensions made foreign credit precarious, the choices narrowed. Raise taxes domestically, confiscate wealth, or acquire resources and revenues by conquest. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 must be seen not only as ideology and strategy, but as the dramatic answer to a financial crunch that public ledgers had long concealed. From London to Stockholm, the headlines asked how Germany could suddenly afford heavy orders for steel, tanks, and ships. Officially, the Reich touted export growth, trade agreements, and private capital. Quietly, diplomats and intelligence services pieced together clues. Hidden credit instruments, secret orders routed through shell companies, and large purchases of Swedish iron ore and Romanian oil. Some foreign banks tolerated covert trade credit arrangements because they were profitable and politically useful. Others grew wary as German demand outstripped visible means of payment.
The Anglo-German Payments Agreement of 1934 and bilateral trade deals provided diplomatic cover for flows of goods and credits, but they could not disguise a fundamental mismatch. Germany's outward appearance of solvency rested on financial legerdemain.
Inside Berlin, the battle line sharpened. Hjalmar Schacht, the central banker wary of unchecked credit expansion, argued for discipline, warning that rolling over MEFO obligations indefinitely would starve the banking system and stoke future collapse. Hermann Göring, architect of the four-year plan, demanded quantity, quick rearmament, strategic control of industry, and political priority over fiscal scruples. The clash was less personality theater than policy. Schacht had designed a subterfuge to buy time. Göring wanted the time spent on guns and rubber. By late 1937, the quarrel cost Schacht his ministerial portfolio. In early 1939, he lost the Reichsbank presidency. The substitution of Walter Funk and Göring's ascent signaled a decisive tilt toward politically controlled economic mobilization.
After the war, Albert Speer's memoirs and later debates reframed the rearmament story around managerial genius and miraculous production. Speer claimed organizational reforms and rationalization drove output, and he suggested that finance followed productivity. Historians have since pushed back. While Speer's ministries did raise efficiency in 1940-42, the fiscal foundations were still the hidden credit apparatus, state commandeering of industry, and coerced labor. Memory and memoir blurred with political self-justification. Production numbers alone cannot explain how the rearmament machine was funded, or why the regime felt compelled to seek resources by conquest once hidden debts and supply bottlenecks tightened. By 1938, the bookkeeping could no longer be plausibly hidden. MEFO bills had been rolled, extended, and reissued until they formed a mountain of contingent liabilities, commonly estimated at around 12 billion Reichsmarks, alongside conventional bonds. Schacht's warnings about pressure on credit markets and the money supply were increasingly public in cabinet papers and diplomatic leaks. Hitler and his inner circle preferred the political payoff of employment and rearmament over transparency. Schacht's resignation and the appointment of Walther Funk signaled a transfer of control from independent central banking to a political economic apparatus that would prioritize war readiness above financial orthodoxy. The effect? Tighter political control, larger off-balance sheets, and a narrowing set of policy choices.
The final pivot. Finance pushed strategy. Hidden liabilities, scarcity of critical raw materials, oil, steel, rubber, and the limits of covert foreign credit created a strategic logic. If Germany could not pay for the inputs it needed, then territorial expansion offered an alternative. Seize resources, secure economic lifelines, and convert political control into fiscal capacity. The invasion of Poland on 1 September 1939 must be read in this dual light, as ideological aggression and as the dramatic, catastrophic answer to an accelerating financial crunch whose off-book IOUs could no longer be indefinitely deferred. In short, MEFO bought time. Conquest tried to pay the bill. War arrived in September 1939, but the financial question did not vanish. It mutated. With MEFO obligations already large, the regime improvised.
priority credit allocation, strict price controls, and forced transfers of corporate profits into war production. The Reich pushed banks to channel credit where the state wanted it. The Reich's Bank and Finance Ministry coordinated to ration foreign exchange and prioritize imports for armaments. At the same time, the economy turned to non-market instruments, quotas, state purchase orders, and allocations that kept factories running while concealing true costs. These improvisations postponed immediate collapse, but increased central control and economic distortion. The hidden liabilities were still waiting. From 1940 onward, the Reich supplemented finance with people and territory. Millions were deported from occupied Europe as forced labor, prisoners of war, civilians, and concentration camp inmates to keep factories and farms running. These coerced workers reduced labor costs and produced goods that the regime could allocate to military ends. Beyond labor, Nazi administrators sought to extract raw materials, food, and industrial capacity from occupied economies. A policy of exploitation that attempted to convert conquered regions into fiscal and resource substitutes for unavailable foreign finance. The moral and human cost was unconscionable. Economically, it was a partial, brutal solution that intensified dependency on conquest. By mid-1941, the regime confronted a brutal arithmetic. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941, was partly driven by a pressing need for oil, grain, and strategic raw materials. The German war machine lacked adequate domestic sources of crude oil and rubber. Imports had been marginalized by wartime pressure. The invasion of the Soviet Union was sold in part as the economic remedy. Seize the Ukraine's grain, the Caucasus oil fields, and the raw materials of the East. Yet the logistics of occupying and extracting these resources proved costly, and by late 1941, shortages in fuel and rubber began to hobble operations. The financial gamble, hidden credit plus conquest equal resource flows, now met the realities of warfare and supply chains. Despite draconian controls, wartime monetary strains surfaced. Price ceilings, rationing, and forced savings were used to curb consumer inflation, but these policies created black markets and social strain. The state insulated the military supply chain at civilian expense. Food and consumer goods were rationed while priority production fed the front. Wage controls and compulsory bonds siphoned purchasing power away from private consumption into state needs, yet they could not eliminate scarcity. Historians note that these policy levers substituted coercion for market correction, a system that maintained military output but frayed civilian morale and economic resilience as the war prolonged. By 1942-43, the cumulative strains told. Stalingrad's disaster, Allied bombing, and supply failures exposed that the prior financial patchworks had limits. MEFO obligations and other hidden debts did not vanish. Instead, the Reich increasingly monetized shortages by squeezing occupied economies, extorting resources, and expanding forced labor, an economic model that could not sustain prolonged strategic defeat. Walther Funk later testified at Nuremberg about the Reich's stretched finances and forced transfers. Post-war research argues that the financial engineering of the 1930s bought time and armaments, but never a durable peace. In the end, the fiscal architecture collapsed under military defeats and moral catastrophe.
By 1943, the lines between front and home blurred. Allied bombing raids widened from military targets to industrial hubs, transport nodes, and port facilities. The resultant disruption strained distribution networks, so the Reich could no longer efficiently move material, food, or fuel. Even as armament factories kept producing, rails and rivers were clogged or destroyed. Finished material piled up where it could not be delivered to units. On the home front, rationing tightened, black markets expanded, and civilian confidence frayed. The economy's hidden supports could not cushion an infrastructure under aerial attack. The fiscal fiction of MEFO and priority lending mattered less when trains stopped running and ports lay in rubble.
Ration cards and price controls were the regime's blunt instruments to restrain civilian consumption and prioritize the military. But markets find gaps. Black markets flourished in basements and back alleys where ration coupons couldn't reach. For many families, everyday life became an arithmetic of coupons, favors, and furtive purchases. Forced saving schemes and payroll levies removed liquidity from households, a hidden tax that subsidized state priorities. Yet it also reduced legal demand for goods, pushed commerce into the shadows, and increased social resentments. The economy's coercive methods held production together, but hollowed out civil society's trust.
Beyond the bombing, Allied measures aimed at choking the Reich's access to foreign exchange and raw materials. Naval blockades, interdiction of shipping, and the severing of credit lines made imports scarcer and more expensive. Diplomatic cover for covert trade, the 1930s bilateral deals, evaporated under wartime scrutiny. Foreign suppliers grew wary or were compelled by Allied pressure to stop vital shipments. As currency convertibility vanished and overseas assets were frozen or seized, Germany's ability to roll over hidden credits diminished. The off-book IOUs relied on a global financial ecosystem that wartime isolation had severed. The regime increasingly relied on plunder and coerced provisioning from occupied territories to plug gaps. A state that finances war through deferred liabilities ultimately meets a day of reckoning. By late 1944, the combination of battlefield defeats, Allied bombing, and loss of trade corridors meant FO obligations and other contingent claims could no longer be plausibly rolled over. Walter Funk and other officials, later questioned at Nuremberg, described a wartime financial structure sustained by forced transfers, confiscations, and opaque bookkeeping, not normal market solvency. The Reich's cupboards were not merely bare, its books were a web of promises to be collected by holders, foreign creditors, and by history itself. When the Third Reich collapsed, the financial architecture collapsed with it. Bonds, bills, and claims became part of the post-war legal and moral accounting.
The post-war reckoning unfolded in courtrooms and commission files. At Nuremberg, Funk's testimony, interrogations of central bank staff, and Allied financial surveys began to piece together how off-book finance and systematic pillage had underwritten the war machine. Occupation authorities banned Nazi financial structures, seized assets, and sought reparations. Economists and historians, from the early court transcripts to later studies, turned MEFO into a cautionary case about fiscal illusion, political control of money, and the moral cost when finance becomes an instrument of conquest.
The lesson resonates. Hidden credit can buy time and guns, but it cannot erase the human cost when accounting tricks substitute for political and economic choices. When the guns fell silent, the economic work began. Clearin' rubble, restorin' transport, and untangling a toxic web of claims and confiscations. Occupation authorities dismantled Nazi financial instruments, froze assets, and imposed controls to stabilize currencies. Reparations and restitution debates consumed diplomats. Who should pay? Who had the legal claims? And how would shattered economies be rebuilt without rewarding the machinery that financed aggression? Economists warned against simplistic analogies. MEFO was not merely a quirky accounting trick, but part of a broader political economy that blurred public and private, coerced profits and state priorities. Post-war reconstruction required not just money, but new institutions, independent central banks, transparent budgets, and legal frameworks to prevent money from becoming a tool of unchecked state plunder. History does not end with balance sheets. In post-war memory, MEFO became a symbol of how technical brilliance can be harnessed to terrible ends, and of how fiscal innovations without democratic checks can enable violence. Memoirs, court transcripts, and scholarship fought over interpretation. Was rearmament a product of managerial genius or of a coercive political economy that left no legal or moral exit? The answer is both. Engineers and bankers delivered output. Political leaders weaponized it. The moral accounting followed. Reparations, legal bans, institutional reforms, and a scholarly consensus that financial ingenuity, divorced from ethical constraint, becomes complicity. For citizens and policymakers, the lesson is perennial. Money can be a public good or an instrument of predation, depending on who controls it and to what ends. Verdict: MEFO and the other fiscal artifices did something simple and terrifying. They bought time. That time was used to rebuild industrial capacity, mobilize millions, and prepare for war. But the method mattered. Hidden bills, forced transfers, coerced labor, and diplomatic sleights of hand substituted short-term illusion for sustainable policy. Those choices narrowed later options. When the hidden claims came due and foreign credit dried up, the regime faced only grim alternatives: extract, confiscate, or conquer. Economic mechanics alone do not explain evil. Ideology, brutality, and the willing participation of institutions do. Yet the financial story is crucial. It reveals how technical solutions can enable political violence, how balance sheets can hide moral costs, and why institutional checks, transparent budgets, independent central banks, and accountable finance are not technocratic niceties, but vital safeguards of peace. Learn the arithmetic, and you begin to understand the politics.